A massive Bitcoin indicator is now flashing, and Jim Cramer is warning of a Bitcoin crash to the US dollar or lower. This isn't a danger, it's actually ultra bullish because Jim Cramer is one of the best contrarian indicators. Every time he warns of a Bitcoin crash, Bitcoin ends up getting pumped afterward. Let's take a look at what's behind this. We have explosive developments with MicroStrategy and Saylor buying Bitcoin for the 9th week. Just minutes ago, Saylor announced more Bitcoin purchases. This is significant due to many short positions on MicroStrategy, potentially leading to a massive short squeeze. If Bitcoin breaks out, MicroStrategy will too. This is particularly explosive because there are now very many short positions here that are also currently focused on MicroStrategy, and this could lead to a massive short squeeze. If Bitcoin breaks out now, then MicroStrategy will break out too. This could trigger a short squeeze and set off the Bitcoin Valhalla pump, pushing Bitcoin over the $100,000 mark and much higher, maybe even to new all-time highs. We also address the dangers because more and more people are saying, or I am getting more and more letters, saying that Saylor has lost his mind. What he is doing here is absolutely not acceptable. He's going to ruin Bitcoin and bring it crashing down. We're going to see if Saylor is really the one bringing Bitcoin down or if it's the other way around, that this short squeeze triggers the Valhalla candle, the Godzilla pump. But first, let's take a look at what Jim Cramer has to say. Pay close attention to what he says about Bitcoin. But first, let's take a look at what Jim Cramer has to say. Listen closely to what he has to say about Bitcoin. Do you think it's cooled off enough? No, I think he's going to be able to. I think 90,000 is the next level. So he's saying here that the Bitcoin market hasn't cooled down enough yet, and this is the next level. That means we can also shoot under those. Down here, 2001. Don't panic when Jim Cramer says something. Bitcoin has moved exactly contrary to his statements. Jim Cramer interviewed Trump recently, who mentioned a US plan for Bitcoin-like oil reserve, sparking FOMO and price increases. So, this is actually an ultra-bullish statement. What's also super interesting is that Jim Cramer had that interview with Donald Trump about 3 or 4 weeks ago, where Trump mentioned that the US is planning something similar to an oil or petroleum reserve, like a Bitcoin reserve, but with oil or petroleum. This sparked FOMO and led to price increases. And that's basically what you need to know about Jim Cramer. He's also really well known. There are old clips where he talks about how it's totally normal on Wall Street to manipulate the market and that people say one thing on TV while setting their own positions differently. And that's basically what you need to know about Jim Cramer. Jim Cramer is well known. There are clips saying it's normal on Wall Street to manipulate the market. He says people say one thing on TV while positioning differently. Say Bitcoin is crashing, but then you're buying Bitcoin and go long. Or say Bitcoin is going to go up, but at the same time, you're selling. Bitcoin crashing. Caution, Wall Street, Jim Cramer manipulates markets via media. Oh, Bitcoin is going to go up, but at the same time, you're selling or something like that. So, you really have to be careful. This is a well-known tactic from Wall Street, especially from Jim Cramer, where the markets are sometimes manipulated through the media. Here, either FOMO is created and then people sell, or there's a warning about a crash and then they buy back in. In the end, these are completely checked out tactics. Jim Cramer can't move the entire Bitcoin market, but caution is needed as it's not as hot as portrayed and could be bullish. Historically, Cramer has been wrong. Flipping his predictions makes him right. Saylor's Saylor.graphic shows new Bitcoin purchases, suggesting another by announcement tomorrow. This marks 9 consecutive weeks of buying, highlighting significant background information. If you shifted 180 degrees, then you were simply always right here. And then Saylor shared his Saylor.graphic, where he basically always draws the dots when new Bitcoin purchases come in. That's always been the case in the past, so tomorrow we'll probably get the announcement that he bought Bitcoin again. This is now 9 weeks in a row where he's been buying Bitcoin, and that's pretty significant because we need to look at some really interesting background information. I saw an interesting video on YouTube yesterday titled "This 2 billion purchase by Saylor." That was the last purchase, not this one, but the last purchase. Could lead to the liquidation of MicroStrategy's 10 billion short positions, creating a massive short squeeze. This means people are currently betting on a falling MicroStrategy price, so they're really bearish right now. Saylor keeps buying without end because they're also speculating, for example, that Saylor is over-leveraging himself, that he's taking on too much. Now you keep hearing stories like, oh, Saylor has gone crazy, and so on. And now there are a lot of people who not only see this, but are also betting on falling MicroStrategy prices, just betting that, for example, the MicroStrategy thing just explodes. If Bitcoin rises, a short squeeze could happen due to more short positions. Saylor's Bitcoin investments without a price increase lead to bearish sentiment. If Bitcoin breaks out, short sellers will be liquidated, causing an upside short squeeze. So, the more Saylor goes all in and buys Bitcoin without the price shooting up, the more people are going to turn bearish. By going all in, I mean the more Bitcoin Saylor buys, but the price doesn't rise, the more folks will bet on falling MicroStrategy prices. And if Bitcoin breaks out and MicroStrategy rises, then all the short sellers here will simply be liquidated, and then there will be a short squeeze upwards. That means the MicroStrategy stock could really pump massively, shooting up to new all-time highs very quickly. And when MicroStrategy pumps, it's always a positive indicator for Bitcoin or a good thing for Bitcoin, because then MicroStrategy can buy even more Bitcoin. That's the crazy part right now. Michael Saylor really needs to step on the gas if the Bitcoin price goes up, because then he can raise as much capital as possible. In a bear market, he can't raise that much capital. That's also what a lot of people don't get. Why does Michael Saylor always buy the top? Why isn't he buying so aggressively during a bear market? Why is he only starting to buy Bitcoin so aggressively now? Yeah, because Bitcoin is showing really strong performance right now, and that makes it a lot easier to raise capital. Michael Saylor is aggressively buying Bitcoin, anticipating a U.S. strategic reserve due to insider info. Trump announces a Bitcoin reserve. Saylor wants to be ready. He also met with Eric Trump, and because he knows this, he's front-running this event, basically buying as much Bitcoin as he can, to have his bags packed when Donald Trump says, "Hey, we're buying Bitcoin now," or "We're converting the confiscated Bitcoin into a strategic Bitcoin reserve." So, for this moment, Michael Saylor wants to be prepared. That's the next theory on why Michael Saylor is buying so much Bitcoin right now. So, we already have two possibilities for why Michael Saylor is buying so much Bitcoin. It could also be that both are true. And now there's actually a third possibility, and I keep hearing it, and a ton of comments here on YouTube. Michael Saylor is buying so much Bitcoin because he is the strategic Bitcoin reserve for the U.S. So, a lot of people really believe that Michael Saylor is accumulating so much Bitcoin because at some point the U.S. is going to come in and just say, "Okay, we're taking this private company MicroStrategy, we're nationalizing it, and turning it into our strategic Bitcoin reserve." That's a theory that, theoretically speaking, works in 2021. But in practice, I have to say, it's a bit of a stretch. Conspiracy theory and all that. So, there's no evidence for that or anything. You'd have to take shareholders' assets, and expropriating shareholders is rare. They've often targeted property owners, or used inflation to take from savers. Large-scale stock expropriation, saying, "Okay, an emergency law for security to seize all MicroStrategy shares," is far-fetched. So, the idea of large-scale expropriation of stocks, where you just say, "Okay, we're enacting an emergency law for national security, and we need to confiscate all MicroStrategy shares," is already quite far-fetched. That's already quite a stretch. So, you really have to be careful here. Theories suggest MicroStrategy and Bitcoin ETFs might be expropriated to form a U.S. strategic Bitcoin reserve. Michael Saylor and Larry Fink, close to the government, are allegedly preparing for this transformation. Michael Saylor and Larry Fink of BlackRock are close to the government. Or maybe MicroStrategy and Bitcoin ETFs could become a strategic Bitcoin reserve for the US. But we must be cautious, these are speculations. I hear these comments, but I don't think this scenario is likely now. But who knows? In a war, anything wild could happen. Or maybe there are other ways to turn these two proxies, MicroStrategy and the Bitcoin ETFs, into a strategic Bitcoin reserve for the U.S. But like I said, we need to be super cautious here. These are all just speculations. These are comments I keep hearing, and I have to honestly say that personally, I don't think the likelihood of such a scenario is very high right now. But who knows? In a war scenario, or whatever, it could always happen that some wild stuff goes down. We also saw it with the gold ban. Max Kaiser, for example, was. I always hear that someday the ETFs might get confiscated, and that's why I always recommend getting a hardware wallet. That way, nothing can be confiscated from you. Even if you host your Bitcoin on a hardware wallet, MicroStrategy doesn't matter at all. I'll drop a link below to a Trezor hardware wallet, one of the best hardware wallets on the planet, definitely one of the best on the market. I absolutely recommend it. You can also get 10% off the purchase of such a hardware wallet with the code BitcoinHotel. So, that's an absolute recommendation. You don't have to worry about whether MicroStrategy is going to expropriate the shareholders, even though that idea is really far-fetched. So, think about this. If MicroStrategy were to expropriate the shareholders, the entire stock market would be in a total panic, because then they could just do that with any other stocks too. Max Kaiser shared something interesting here, specifically about the MicroStrategy topic. He says, 40 years, the Federal Reserve, the U.S. central bank, made stock bets one way, flooded corrections with printed dollars. This is the Greenspan put, causing a liquidity surplus of trillions. Problems aren't addressed. New money is just printed, like a doctor giving pills without solving issues. The Federal Reserve pumps liquidity into the market to cover every crisis. This is referred to as the Greenspan put and led to a global liquidity surplus of several hundred trillion US dollars. Problems aren't addressed. New money is printed. The Federal Reserve pumps liquidity into the market to cover crises. Saylor and others are converting this liquidity surplus into Bitcoin. The process is under 3% complete, and Max Keiser sees Bitcoin as a black hole, absorbing the liquidity surplus. And now he says that Saylor, along with others, is pulling this liquidity surplus out by converting it into Bitcoin through securitizations at MicroStrategy. As of now, the process is less than 3% complete, which means Max Keiser believes that Bitcoin is like a black hole, sucking the liquidity surplus out of our economy. So, the Fed has been pumping money in for years, just pumping and pumping, and now Michael Saylor isn't going long on the US dollar anymore. He's going short on the dollar and long on Bitcoin. And this leads to the US dollar continuing to weaken, while liquidity is being pulled out and flowing into Bitcoin. At some point, the US dollar is just going to be completely done for because there's no demand for it anymore, and the dollars just keep getting more and more worthless. And that means Bitcoin is going to pump even more, while the US dollar is hitting massively towards zero. So, you have to say that Jim Cramer is probably predicting a dollar collapse more than a Bitcoin collapse, because it's way more likely that the dollar will collapse than Bitcoin. And then Michael Saylor also posts something very interesting. He says here, Bitcoin is, and I quote, Bitcoin, not the S&P 500 is your new benchmark for investments. It's the ultimate store of value. The sooner you understand this, the sooner you'll build wealth and save your time in the most effective way. And here you can see the different returns. You can see here, for example, Bitcoin, 35%, 1,000%, 300%. So, always relatively high. Then S&P, the S&P 500 usually has returns like 11%, 19%, 28%, 25%, 25%, and 28, 25, 25, and most. Let's say investors just have a hurdle rate, for example, like that of a US Treasury bond, which makes about 3% a year. The slightly better investors have a hurdle rate, so let's say a benchmark value from the S&P 500, which averages around 20% a year or 15. P 500, which then on average makes about 20% per year or 15. But Michael Saylor clearly says, no guys, you need to compare yourselves to Bitcoin. Any investment that doesn't beat Bitcoin is making you poorer. Any investment that beats Bitcoin makes you richer. So right now, there are really only maybe 3, 4, or 5 investments worldwide that can actually outperform Bitcoin. Maybe more, maybe there are 10 or so worldwide. And they usually only manage to outperform Bitcoin temporarily. One of them was, for example, Metaplanet. One of them was, for example, MicroStrategy, which is basically just a leverage play on Bitcoin. But that's really the important thing to take away here. Don't compare yourselves to the S&P 500, but compare yourselves to Bitcoin. P 500, but compare yourselves to Bitcoin. And accordingly, anyone who invests in real estate, anyone who invests in stocks and standard indices or stock indices, and also anyone who invests in gold will become poorer compared to Bitcoin. Let that sink in. And if you want to buy Bitcoin now, I'll put a link down below to 21 Bitcoin. The easiest way to buy Bitcoin in Europe. 2001. Here you can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin with the code BitcoinHotel. See you later. Peace out, 1000.